It's been described as the most prestigious award in the world, the Nobel Peace Prize, whose past winners include global heavyweights such as Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela. But this year's award to the European Union is adding to growing criticism over the choice of winners and the politics behind the decisions. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. Welcome to the program. Well, the European Union has been awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee praised leaders for fostering peace on a continent that had been ravaged by war. It said the Union and its forerunners have for over 6 decades contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. But the decision has drawn condemnation and criticism. Human rights groups argue the European Union is undemocratic and maintains a large military presence, even as its people suffer the effects of an economic downturn. Past leaders, including South African social rights activist Desmond Tutu, are among those saying the EU doesn't deserve the award. The controversy is stirring memories of the 2009 award given to US President Barack Obama in his first year in office, when he was commander-in-chief of a country at war in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The Nobel Peace Prize is awarded on December the 10th each year to mark the anniversary of the death of Alfred Nobel. He was a Swedish chemist and armaments manufacturer whose inventions included dynamite. He used his fortune to bequeath a series of prizes, the first being awarded in 1901. As well as the Peace Prize, there are awards in chemistry, physics, physiology, or medicine and literature. Nobel's will stated that the Peace Prize be administered by Norway, although why it is unclear. The head of the Norwegian Nobel Committee is Torbjørn Lagland, the current Secretary General of the Council of Europe. A prize from him then to the European Union may appear to some more like a pat on the back from a good friend. So is the Nobel Prize losing its prestige? Well, to help us answer this question, we're joined by our guests. In London, Petros Fasoulas. He is chairman of the European Movement UK campaign group. And from Oslo, Fredrik Heffermel. He is a former Norwegian lawyer and author of the book, The Nobel Peace Prize, What Nobel Really Wanted. Welcome to both of you. Petros Fasoulas, if I could start with you. Why do you believe the EU deserves this award?
Well, the EU is one of the most ambitious projects of supranational and international cooperation. It was put together right after the Second World War to ensure that European states get bound together in a common market, in a common political structure, in a collection of institutions that require consensus to ensure that the devastation of the Second World War was never repeated again. And the experiment was so successful that it made itself into a beacon of democracy that attracted towards it both states from Southern Europe that for the best part of the post-war war were under dictatorships like Spain, Greece and Portugal, and also states in Central and Eastern Europe which found themselves on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and they saw eventual integration in the European Union as their way out of dictatorship. So in those 2-3 ways, the European Union has indeed solidified democracy and peace in Europe and made sure that that democracy and peace was extended throughout the continent.
Fredrik Heffermel, I know you feel differently about this, but Petros has a point there. There's been uninterrupted peace in Europe for more than half a century, putting aside, of course, the Balkan Wars of the 1990s for a moment, which were not part of the European Union at that time. But doesn't the fact that we have had peace in most of Europe for much of the last half century, doesn't the European Union deserve some credit for that?
Well, perhaps most of all the nations of Europe have been bound by the UN Charter, which I went into in 1945, where the idea was to never use military force against each other, and that is a global agreement of which the EU is not. The EU does not have the central ambition of the Nobel's intention with the Peace Prize was to establish a global system of demilitarized nations, building on international law. You build trust and the foundations for skipping armaments altogether. Nobel did never say to the Norwegian parliament, here is a sum of money and use it for anything you find useful for peace. He said, here is a prize that shall go to the champions of peace. That was the word he used, and he explained it as those who fight for this demilitarized global peace order through peace congresses and through, well, abolition and reduction of armies.
All right, well, we'll talk a little bit more about what Alfred Nobel intended as we expand on this a little bit more and give us a little bit more perspective. Take a moment to look at some past winners whose global accomplishments have made them household names. The civil rights activist that we mentioned at the top, Martin Luther King, was awarded the 1964 Peace Prize. He was recognized for his nonviolent resistance to racial prejudice in the US. Mother Teresa was awarded the prize in 1979, her charity work now known all over the world. And Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid activist who spent 27 years in jail, awarded the prize in 1993 for leading the drive towards peace and democracy in his country and the end of apartheid. Well, here, by the way, is Alfred Nobel's vision when he set up the Peace Prize in his name back in 1895. He asked that the prize be awarded to, and I quote, the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses. Well, given all of that then, let's look at some of the awards that were considered a little more controversial. In 1973, Henry Kissinger was rewarded for his work on the Vietnam Peace Accords, even though he instituted a secret bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese army. Former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was a Nobel winner in 1978. This despite his involvement in the 1946 bomb attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which killed 91 people. Fast forward to 2009, when the prize went to Barack Obama, less than a year after he became US president for what was described as his, quote, extraordinary efforts in international diplomacy. This was despite the fact that he led a country at war in both Iraq and Afghanistan and was about to increase dramatically the number of American troops in Afghanistan. And last year, the Peace Prize was split among three women: Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Liberian peace activist Leymah Gbowee, and a Yemeni women's rights campaigner Tawakkul Karman. Now, this raised concerns about whether the award was based on trying to boost the role of women rather than real achievement. The questions in particular were raised about the Liberian leader's commitment to peace and democracy. So, Petros Fasoulas, if I could turn back to you then. It's hard to convince many people suffering under austerity cuts in Greece and Spain in particular, just what the EU is doing to foster peace and prosperity in that regard.
Well, I think we have to separate the two. The pursuit of peace in a continent is quite different to the pursuit of economic policies that ensure employment and growth. And whether we like it or not, over the 10 years of the single currency's existence, economic management remained within the control of member states. And in some cases, like Greece or Spain, Portugal, even Ireland, those governments made their own kind of decisions. That shouldn't take away anything from the fact that the European Union has created a circle of stability within which its member states can operate and pursue in cooperation their common interest. But I will agree with you that the current crisis is indeed one of existential nature, and the European Union and its member states are confronted with the choice of splitting up and go it alone, or coming closer together and pursuing their common interest. And I think the Nobel Committee has chosen this particular year to award the European Union this very prestigious prize exactly to remind the EU leaders and the citizens of the European Union how much they have achieved together over the last 60 years and what are the benefits of cooperation.
So it was,
indeed,
in your view then, this was more of a wake-up call to them, a morale boost perhaps. Look at what you've done over the last 50 years, don't let this all fall apart.
it was a reminder, I think, of how far we've gone over the last 60 years. And when we have voices, extreme right-wing voices talking in nationalistic terms and xenophobic terms, I think the Nobel Committee wanted to remind everyone what are the advantages of cooperation and how looking beyond nationalistic self-interest can actually help us promote our common good.
All right, Frederick Hamel, I want to put that same point to you, that there was perhaps, in the view of some, a political agenda at work here from the Nobel Committee. And if that's the case, is that what they should be doing?
No, the Nobel Committee was not given money to use for whatever purpose they like. And they should, the Greek population should be very much aware that their austerity is due to an obligation within the EU, where they are under pressure not to do any cuts in their military spending or their import of weapons from Germany. So Nobel had a recipe for many of the economic troubles that pester the world today. The environmental trouble, the human rights problems, the democracy problems. The military is a force which is putting all these valuable central human concerns in jeopardy. Everywhere, every year, they could be done much better with taking Nobel seriously. And my experience is now, for 5 years I have been explaining to the committee what their mandate is and what their legal obligation is. And they don't care at all. There is nothing they want less to hear about than Alfred Nobel and his intention when he established the Nobel Peace Prize for the champions of peace, for disarmament, for global disarmament. So the discussion, you can discuss for in many ways whether what the EU has done to peace and so on, but it is irrelevant. It has the exact opposite purpose of what Nobel had in mind. It has an agreement, fundamental agreement on promoting the military force of the Union, and it has is going now in just 4 days. On Friday, the EU leaders will meet in Brussels to make a new agreement on military cooperation. This is exactly the opposite of what this Nobel Prize was intended to achieve. It spits in the face of Nobel.
All right.
The Norwegian committee, yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the points that you mentioned there about what Alfred Nobel's intentions were. But as I mentioned earlier, some past winners have criticized this decision to award the Peace Prize to the EU. Among them is 1980 winner Adolfo Pérez Esquivel. Here's what he had to say.
We're surprised by the last designations by the Nobel Committee. In the case of Barack Obama, Al Gore, and now the European Union, when the US and EU nations are at war. They are part of NATO. They invade, plunder, kill. We've seen it in Libya, Syria. We see it all over the world. The military bases they have in the Malvinas Islands. So we're worried about a prize like the Nobel, which has to be about contributing to peace, can be used in this way.
Well, that's for the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. Here's his reaction to receiving the award on behalf of the European Union.
It's an award for the European project, for the people and for the institutions that day after day, for the last 60 years, have built a new Europe. It is a good moment to remind ourselves of what the European Union has done. It brings lasting peace between former enemies who fought many devastating wars on the continent, including 2 world wars.
Right, so 2 opposite views there, but both of those men touching to a certain extent on the issue of security. And Petros Fasoulas, I want to put this point to you. I mean, Mr. Heffermel, Frederick Heffermel, makes the argument there that the fact that the European Union may have been responsible for providing peace and security in its own continent is an irrelevant point, because that is not what Alfred Nobel intended.
We shouldn't discount the efforts that the European Union does to promote peace around the world. The EU is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, contributor of aid globally, and all the provision of financial economic assistance is usually based on certain conditions that ensure the maintenance of peace in the regions where the EU operates. Also, the EU sends peacekeeping forces in hotbeds of activity. It contributes considerably in crisis management and, when possible, crisis resolution. So there is an element in the European Union that envisions the extension of peace beyond its borders, and considerable financial resources are invested in that sense. I would like to address the point made about military cooperation. I think proportionally the European Union member states are actually reducing the money they spend on military expenditure, and I think the notion of cooperating on areas of defense and foreign affairs is there to ensure a different type of world for the whole of our planet. Don't forget that the European Union is projecting a sort of soft power around the world. It doesn't invade countries, it doesn't indeed promote conflict. Instead, it promotes economic cooperation and provides financial assistance to make sure that the EU model is applied in other areas of the world too. I also want to see one day where the European Union will be free of arms and free of armies. But I don't think that should take away from the fact that how much the EU has done to preserve peace in Europe and extend it around the world.
Frederick Heffermeyer, what's your response to that?
Well, I can only say that Nobel had a recipe, a very fundamental recipe. And I think the prizes of the last 4 or 5 years have been absolutely on the opposite purpose of what Nobel had in mind. And this is not only a betrayal of Nobel, but it's a betrayal of the population.
I appreciate you want to talk about what Alfred Nobel's original intentions are. But I just want to ask you specifically on the issue of the European Union and whether it has, for the most part, tried to foster peace, not just within its borders, but also beyond the European continent.
I think that's a very mixed bag of considerations, and I think the EU has been operating and supporting military steps in very. It's very fine to participate in peace-making missions of various kinds, but if they are not in keeping with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. That is a basic thing, and the EU has decided that it is prepared to use military force without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council. So they are basically undermining the global order that they should support via the United Nations.
Petros Vassoulis, I know you want to respond to that.
I just wanted to make the point that it wasn't the EU, but it was certain member states of the European Union that have indeed interfered in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was exactly because there is no common foreign policy in the EU at the moment, that wasn't a decision taken from the EU as a whole. Certain member states participating in that operation as per their membership of NATO, but it wasn't the EU itself. And I'm more than happy to engage in an argument about promoting a bit more cooperation on common foreign security policy and indeed defense policy as well. But we shouldn't blame the EU for what certain member states have done in certain parts of the world.
All right, well, we've all been talking here for quite some time about whether this award was deserved or not, but let's get the view now of some people on the street in the European Union who've reacted to this award.
I just don't think it's good. It's crazy. What has the EU done? Surely there are people who have done better things.
I think the European Union deserves this prize. The reconciliation of European countries after World War II has served as an example for the rest of the world.
I don't know. They have done good things, but the prize comes at a wrong time. They could have received it earlier. At the moment, I think it's much too late. They could well have gotten it a long time ago.
All right, some valid points there from a very unscientific sampling of people there. But one of the points made there was the fact, first of all, of the timing of this award and whether there were many others who were far more deserving, Petros Vassoulis.
Well, I certainly agree. There are a lot of people and a lot of organizations around the world that are working towards world peace and satisfying the criteria that Mr. Nobel had set up himself when the prize was first given. But that shouldn't, the fact that we cannot celebrate everybody at the same time, and next year there will be other individuals and other organizations whose contribution to world peace will be recognized. But in the meantime, we should just pause for a second and acknowledge what the EU has achieved. And also look at what's happening around the world. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, there are efforts to replicate the project of integration that has been taking place in the European Union. In Africa, an African Union is being put together to model to a large extent what has been going on in Europe. So we see that the example of European integration is being replicated around the world exactly because it's seen as a successful way of binding together nations that previously used to be at war against each other or certainly compete vigorously for resources. And I think that should be one of the main reasons why we're celebrating today the European Union and its contribution for peace.
Frederick Heffermel, what do you think then is the motivation behind the Nobel Committee when they give out awards, not only this year's awards, but some of the previous controversial prizes that we mentioned earlier?
You know, there is immense secrecy around the award process. We don't know who is nominated. That's kept secret for 50 years. There is no openness about the discussion in the committee, and there is no records taken. It's prohibited to reveal anything of the discussion about the candidates inside the committee. But I think that the main secrecy of the Peace Prize, which the committee is absolutely determined to keep secret, that is the true purpose of the prize. They never address or show any mistake in my analysis and my documentation of what Nobel had in mind. They just ignore it, and this is very, very. I'm more and more concerned with what this has to tell about the standard of democracy or the level of a functioning democracy in Norway. And of course, when it's so bad here, you can imagine that this is the new methods that are being employed to use political force is involving more and more PR agencies. That was bad before, but when it also reaches the political scene, democracy dies. You have to have the facts on the table, you have to have arguments, and you have to have honest answers to the argument, and not just go on stating untruth or half-truth, hoping to get away with it.
All right, Petros Vassoulis, I give you the last word in the minute or so that we've got left. The EU, which for the past 3 years has been a virtual byword for disorder and indecision because of its failure to get on top of things like the sovereign debt crisis. Do you see that continuing for years to come?
Well, we shouldn't discount how much the European Union has achieved in such a short period of time to address what it is in effect a global economic crisis that has invaded certain parts of the Eurozone, because not the whole of the EU is in crisis. Certain parts of the EU are in crisis, and unfortunately the decision-making structures haven't been able to keep up with the markets. But I do agree with you that this Nobel Prize is an honor, but it's also a responsibility. It's there to remind EU leaders as well the brave decisions that their predecessors took in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, and remind them that such brave decisions are necessary right now if we are to ensure that the construction of the EU remains intact.
All right, and on that note, we will leave it. Thank you to both of our guests in London, Petros Vassoulis, and from Oslo, Frederick Heffermel. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Don't forget, you can find this show and other programs on our website. That's aljazeera.com. Just click on Inside Story. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.